Hello and welcome to another Innovator interview on Earth911's Sustainability in Your podcast. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we're going to talk about polystyrene today. We're joined by Mark Marrinozi, who is the Vice President of Marketing at World Centric. It's a B Corporation, that is a public benefit corporation that's done some fantastic work with advocacy about food packaging, but they've also stepped in to carry a line of products that are completely compostable. That are alternatives to the kinds of polystyrene packaging you see in a lot of fast food joints today. And they are designed to be earth-friendly. But you all, Mark, welcome to the show, by the way. You're working on polystyrene awareness. Tell us about polystyrene and the health threats that it represents when we use it as food packaging.
You bet. First of all, thanks for having me on the program. So polystyrene is probably most commonly known as styrofoam, but it is also known as the number 6 plastic. When you see those little triangles that are out there on a whole variety of things, most commonly what you're going to see is a little triangle with arrows on it with a 6, and it has a PS underneath it.
Right.
That PS means polystyrene. And polystyrene comes in a number of forms, either rigid or foamed. Mm-hmm. The most common is expanded polystyrene, or EPS, which is, as I mentioned, known as styrofoam. You find it everywhere. It's in sheets that are in walls of homes for insulation. It's in packing peanuts. It's in injection molded products like plates and cutlery. Mm-hmm. It's in aspirin bottles. It's in compact discs and DVD discs. It's coat hangers. I mean, you name it, toys.
And clamshell food containers.
Exactly.
Now, so why is it bad? And what is it about styrene in particular that makes it bad?
Well, it's an extremely durable product. Mm-hmm. It has the ability, even despite when it becomes litter into our environment and the elements, wind and sun and ocean currents break it down, as it degrades, still stays within its general form, just in smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. Mm-hmm. It will also leach, and that leaching is primarily creating carcinogens such as styrene and benzene. And there are many studies that show that those elements, when they get into the human body and into animals and plants that we eat, that it becomes pervasive and it suddenly becomes either a chemical that will disrupt all sorts of things in your immune system or in your organs, or it will simply continue to break down and become the microplastics that sadly all of us have in our bodies, in our bloodstream, and all over in the environment. So, that durability that made it such an amazing plastic, when it first started really getting commercialized back in the 40s and 50s, has now become something that is, a carcinogen. It's becoming litter, and it really poses a fundamental risk to humanity. And I might say not only in its use and disposal, but even in the manufacturing.
Right.
In the manufacturing of polystyrene, which is the 5th largest industrial producer of hazardous waste, that manufacturing in and of itself also releases pollution in the form of emissions, in the form of toxic chemicals that are used in the process of making it that mm-hmm. also get into the environment.
So styrene in particular mimics estrogen in the human body and can cause all sorts of imbalances. And does that leach out when we put warm food into a clamshell container?
Yeah, so there's studies that really come to lead that the styrenes can leach out. They also leach out when they get into plants and animals that we eat. But ultimately, that styrene, as you mentioned, it mimics estrogens. And so what that does is it causes your body to think that it should be doing certain things in terms of hormonal functions when it shouldn't. So it can lead to problems with your thyroid. It can lead to potentially cancers. It's believed that it's a contributor to breast cancer and prostate cancer. There's evidence that the chronic exposure will lead to liver damage as well as nerve tissue damage. And the part of the problem with this is it's also become so pervasive. And it's even starting to affect not just adults, but even fetuses, even young children. So to where you can't get away from it anymore. The microplastics and the chemicals are literally background noise, so to speak, everywhere. So, the more of it that is added to the environment, the worse that things will become. And so, go ahead.
And the thing is that we add it to the environment constantly. In California, you had actually a stat I hadn't seen is that only 0.2% of the polystyrene food packaging in California was recycled in 2004. So 99.8% of this material is still out there in the environment because it doesn't break down.
Well, the 0.2% is quite simply because the majority of polystyrene that's used in food packaging has food residue on it. So even when there are facilities, there are very, very few facilities in the United States that can actually take polystyrene and do some processing to it. And it's typically a post initial use processing to where it's used for a down cycle type of a product. It's not an upcycle type of a product. So it's usually used as an additive in other plastics.
Right.
And those plastics are rendered impossible to recycle. But part of the reason why it's so little of it is capable of recycling is also not just because of the lack of infrastructure to recycle it, but because most of it is contaminated with food residue. So anytime you have any type of food packaging that's made from plastic and it has food residue in it, it is immediately contaminating the recycling stream.
Right.
Let's say that you have a clamshell container and it's not even expanded polystyrene. Maybe it's a clear plastic rigid form of polystyrene. That, you might get a cake out of it, or you might get a sandwich out of it in your local grocery store. You grab that and go. And you go and eat it, and there's some residual of that cake in there, or there's some leftovers of the sandwich. And let's say you don't finish that, and you put it in the recycling bin. And we all do wish cycling. You wish that container that's a number 6 polystyrene rigid container that has food residue in it is going to get recycled. Well, your wish is not going to happen. What happens is it gets to the recycling facility. As it goes through the high-speed systems that they have, anything that has food residue is immediately kicked out, and it ends up in a landfill.
And that's, the sorting is one thing. The other is the economic viability of recycling expanded polystyrene, because most of it's air. And so you can spend $1,000 to get roughly $400 worth of materials out of it. And that makes this both impractical and uneconomical, as well as the fact that we don't have a good sorting system to identify and capture this stuff. So clearly, the easiest solution here is to get this stuff out of the system. So why is it that so many states have had legislation proposed about this, but so few have adopted bans on it? There are many cities in the United States that do ban this kind of packaging, but why hasn't this been able to get hold and turn into a regulatory regime to prevent this kinds of pollution?
Well, that's a really good question. I would say it's a combination of things. There's no one smoking gun. First of all, you have the plastics industry, and they're extremely well entrenched. They have very deep-pocketed lobbyists, both at the state level and at the federal level, that are spending a lot of money on the part of the members of their organizations to fight back on styrofoam bans, fight back on plastic bag bans, fight back on disposable plastic bans for cutlery and straws. I I happened to go to one of those organizations' annual meetings earlier this year and sat in as their lobbyist, gave a presentation and talked about all of the pending legislation around the United States. And the comment that he made was, there's even states where they saw as previously friendly to the petroleum plastic-based packaging industry, they now see as not so friendly. And I remember hearing that and the hair on the back of my neck standing up, thinking, wow, that's how they look at it. They don't look at it as we need to transition out of utilizing this material. They see it as we have to fight tooth and nail for our continued way of doing business.
So, Mark, what I hear you saying is, just like in the oil industry, there's a subsidy and a lot of defense of the business in place already. So, how can consumers lead business to the right decisions? Because they're the ones who are out buying the fast food. They're the ones buying the salad or buying the sandwich in the number 6 plastic. What are the options that they should be considering and pointing businesses to? And I know, of course, World Centric provides some of that. So let's disclose that clearly as we say so. What should people be suggesting?
Well, first of all, I think consumers, if they just take a little bit of time to educate themselves, will learn quite a bit about the restaurants and grocery stores and coffee shops in their community that are committing to using alternatives to polystyrene and alternatives to other materials such as wood fiber as well.
Sure.
I'll give you a perfect example, which is, with a coffee shop. In the U.S., we currently cut down about 20 million trees a year, and we pump about 231,000 barrels of oil out of the ground to make the coffee cups that we use when we go to our coffee shops and we don't have a reusable coffee mug.
Yep.
And that's for typically, on average, about 20 to 30 minutes of enjoyment of your coffee. And then you're throwing that away. And that creates a huge amount of waste. Now, that waste, a lot of people feel are coffee cups that they can throw in the recycling bin, and they can't, because that oil that you pumped out of the ground is used to make the linings in those coffee cups that allow them to be water resistant. And those linings are fused to the paper. And also, most of those cups are made out of virgin wood fiber. And those trees are cut down, and they take, on average, 50 to 100 years to regenerate. They have a cup that is made from a tree that's going to take a long time to grow again, and a limited precious resource we pump out of the ground for 30 minutes of enjoyment. It gets thrown into the recycling with people thinking it can get recycled, and it can't, because there's only 2 facilities in the United States that can unfuse the plastic lining from that virgin wood fiber. So it ends up going into a landfill. So consumers, if they just have that little piece of knowledge, can then say, all right, I'm either going to bring a reusable mug, or if that's inconvenient for me, I'm going to frequent coffee shops that are committing to using compostable coffee cups. Compostable lids. and they can use that action to advocate for change.
And let's be clear, now those lids can be clear or white plastic, but they can still be compostable. A lot of people see plastic and they assume that lid is not going to break down. But what, and this is the question that the consumer should be aware of, is what is that called? What should they ask for? What is that material called?
Well, they should say, hey, when they walk in the coffee shop, they should ask for compostable food service ware, a compostable cup and lid. And, typically that lid is made out of what's called PLA, or plant-based plastic. So they can simply say, hey, do you use plant-based materials? Plant-based plastics and plant-based cups are made from renewable agricultural feedstocks. And what that means is it's typically made out of, in the case of those plant-based plastics, either sugar beets or cassava or corn, and it's the agricultural byproduct. It's not the actual corn that we eat for human consumption. Right. And in the case of with the fibers for the cup, they're typically made out of either sugarcane or bamboo fiber, which have fiber that's very similar to wood fiber. In fact, some would argue it's even more durable than wood fiber. But it only takes those things months rather than decades to grow. And the corn is equally rapidly renewable. Sure. So you're using renewable feedstocks, number one. Number two is you're using quite often materials that either were burned, thrown away, or used at a lower end use. So for example, sugarcane, once you press sugarcane to make sugar, the bagasse, as it's called, the waste, was taken and burned. And that would create emissions that were not necessarily good for the environment. Right. Instead of doing that, you can create a pulp out of it and make a cup out of it. And that keeps the wood fiber out of the disposable food service use stream. And it also, in the case of the plant-based plastic, keeps you from using petroleum-based products. Now,
go ahead.
Last thing I'll point out is that it takes less energy to produce plant-based materials than it takes to produce the petroleum or wood fiber-based materials. The statistics that we like to quote are that it takes about 2/3 less energy to make the fiber parts of our products, like the cups and the plates and bowls and containers, than it takes to just make one polystyrene foam plate. And it takes about half of the energy to make a plant-based utensil versus a polystyrene utensil. So that means less energy, less CO2 and greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere. And that's also good for the environment. So you always have to look at the beginning of life and the end of life. So when your consumers walk into that coffee shop and they're asking for a compostable, they're not only asking to see whether or not they have compostables that could compost down into soil, but they're also asking if they have compostables because they have a benefit at the beginning of the manufacturing process as well.
And in talking with coffee shop owners, for instance, that have made the investment in moving over to compostable cups and reducing their reliance on plastic and wood across the board, they report that it may cost them a little more initially to make the change, but in the long term, because they're actually getting more business and people are appreciative of their efforts, their business grows in response to that. Now, the economics, of course, have to all work out in the long term. Do these things cost more on a per unit basis, or are they cheaper? And it sounds like they should be cheaper and will be when we get to scale.
Yes, when World Centric started selling compostable food service ware, they were more expensive, and you had really adopters. You had pioneers that were willing to put their stake in the ground and say, I don't care how much it costs. I am, committed to this. And those early pioneers really helped get things going to where then the coffee shop down the street all of a sudden started getting some of the business getting poached away from them because some of their customers were going to that coffee shop that was committing to being more sustainable.
Right.
Well, that coffee shop that was losing the business would then start coming to us and saying, okay, we need to get on board this train. And so then they started utilizing compostables as well. And that kept growing and growing to where now you have some of the bigs, as I like to call them, the really big companies that are looking at all this and going, boy, we used to see those guys as ankle biters. Well, we don't anymore because they're stealing a lot of our business away because of the quality of their coffee, how they source their coffee, the quality of their food service ware, that they're using compostables. And then suddenly they're saying, wow, we better start making change. To where now you're starting to see large coffee chains, large quick serve restaurants, large fast casual restaurants that are also making the change. Or new ones that are coming up, and they're simply saying, hey, we're not going to go down the path of using polystyrene. We're going to start with compostable materials. That would be, a lot of the newer restaurants, restaurant chains, and some of the newer coffee chains as well that you see that are coming online over the past 5 to 10 years. And it's really, again, where the consumer is voting through their pocketbook. They're saying, I'm going to walk down the street, pay a little bit more money, but I know I'm doing the right thing. I feel good about that. And I'm also trying to make changes in little ways. They may not be able to put solar paneling on their roof right away. They may not be able to switch over to an electric vehicle right away. But they can go and buy a compostable cup instead of a polystyrene cup.
And despite many of the arguments that we can't make a difference when we make these small choices, they add up. And what you've described is an environment where the consumer is doing better for themselves, their family, and the planet, but the business is going to make more money along with expending fewer resources to do it. And that's the change that we actually have to commit to here, is to reimagine the entire system. Now, World Centric started as an advocacy group, and you give 25% of your revenue to various causes. Tell us a little more about the company and how it got here. Did it start with a realization that food packaging was the problem? What's the history of World Centric?
You bet. So our founder and still CEO, Asim Das, started the company in 2004. Prior to that, Asim was an artificial intelligence software engineer in Silicon Valley. And he was surrounded by a lot of consumerism, a lot of wealth, a lot of materialism.
A lot of throwaway, too.
A lot of throwaway, that's right. And so he launched the company in 2004, initially as a nonprofit. And what he was doing to start was he was hosting documentaries and speakers about really urgent issues around social, environmental issues and human rights. And in order to be able to have a nonprofit that wasn't going to have to constantly hold his hand out for getting money from foundations and constantly chasing after grants and whatnot, he decided that he would look for some products that the company could sell. And so initially it was actually selling fair trade goods. And then it started selling compostables. And Asim was really one of the first in the United States that started bringing compostables to awareness in food service. And he, it started becoming a self-sustaining organization by, those purchases, to where by the time that 2009 came rolling around, the company, the nonprofit, was going so well around the sales that it was taking so much time up that he decided to convert over and become a certified B Corp and also a California Benefit Corporation in 2015. In order to be able to continue to fulfill the mission of identifying and helping urgent global grassroots social environmental programs. And so when it flipped over to becoming a for-profit B Corporation what Asim put in place was that the company would commit to giving at least 25% of its net profits to these global grassroots programs. And then he started working with an organization out of San Francisco called Lift Economy. Mm-hmm. And then we've started building up our own internal impact program support to where we vet proposals for individual projects that come to us from a variety of different organizations around the world. And then every year we fund a certain number of those projects that come from shortlisted nonprofits. So last year, for example, through our 25% of our net profits, we funded 22 projects that came from 10 nonprofits. And those nonprofits run the range. They're doing everything from providing clean drinking water in the Bidi Bidi refugee camp, which is the second largest refugee camp in the world, to helping to bring K through 12 education to some of the poorest of the poor children, especially girls in the slums of Mumbai and in Haiti. Mm-hmm. We're also helping to do community building in basically bringing trainers in that help small businesses get up and running, very small, through microloans and through helping communities to learn how to get and start up and create thriving small businesses. There's all sorts of projects that we get involved in. That's is one that I have a soft spot with. We've been planting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of trees in Africa and in Haiti. And needless to say, because of the recent hurricane, I'm sure we're going to be doing even more of that in the years to come to try to help reforestation and help some of the devastation that occurs when these natural disasters come about as a result of climate change.
Well, Mark, this is fascinating, and it's obvious that if you want to support good food packaging, this is a way not only to do that, but to extend the money you spend to good projects around the world. So folks, check out worldcentric.com. And we've been talking to Mark Marrinozi, who is the Vice President of Marketing for World Centric. We'll be back with another episode of Sustainability in Your Ears soon. Thanks very much for listening.